November 1918. The guns fell silent across Europe. For years of mechanized slaughter had ended. Empires that had stood for centuries lay in ruins. But in London, Paris, and New York, a different war had already begun. This one would be fought not with artillery and trenches, but with concession agreements, diplomatic cables, and hastily drawn maps. The prize was not territory alone. It was something far more valuable. Something that would define the coming century. Oil. The Ottoman Empire was dying. For 600 years, it had sprawled across 3 continents, from the gates of Vienna to the shores of the Persian Gulf. Now it gasped its final breaths, carved apart by the victorious allies who circled like vultures. But beneath the desert sands of Mesopotamia, beneath the ancient cities of Mosul and Baghdad, lay an ocean of petroleum. The British knew it. The French suspected it. And the Americans were determined not to be shut out. This is the story of how the United States quietly, and not so quietly, bought the Ottoman Empire's oil rights. It is a tale of secret treaties and broken promises, of visionary industrialists and calculating diplomats, of a single red line drawn on a map that would trap the world's most powerful oil companies in a gilded cage of their own making. It begins not in the Middle East, but in the cold waters of the North Sea, with a decision that would change everything. In 1911, Winston Churchill was 47 years old and newly appointed as First Lord of the Admiralty, the civilian head of the Royal Navy. The Empire's greatest military asset, the fleet had ruled the waves for a century, powered by British coal dug from British mines by British workers. It was a closed circle of industrial might and strategic independence. But Churchill saw what others refused to acknowledge. The age of coal was ending. The age of oil was beginning. And Britain had no oil. Oil burned hotter than coal. It produced more energy per ton. Ships powered by oil could travel faster and farther without refueling. Oil engines required smaller crews and less maintenance. Most critically, oil could be pumped directly into a ship's bunkers, eliminating the backbreaking labor of loading thousands of tons of coal by hand. In a naval engagement, these advantages could mean the difference between victory and annihilation. Germany was already building oil-powered dreadnoughts. If Britain did not follow, the Royal Navy would become obsolete. But the decision was fraught with risk. Switching to oil meant abandoning the security of domestic coal for dependence on foreign petroleum supplies. It meant building new infrastructure, retraining crews, redesigning ships. It meant betting the entire British Empire on a fuel source that Britain did not possess. Many in Parliament thought Churchill was mad. Admiral Sir John Fisher, the crusty naval reformer who had first championed oil power, stood nearly alone in supporting him. Together, they pushed the conversion forward. In July 1913, Churchill stood before the House of Commons and announced Britain's naval oil policy. The Royal Navy would convert to petroleum. New battleships would burn oil exclusively. Older vessels would be retrofitted. To secure supplies, the British government would take a controlling stake in the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which held concessions in Persia, modern-day Iran. It was an unprecedented move. The British state had never before owned shares in a commercial oil company. But these were not ordinary times. The decision had immediate strategic consequences. If Britain needed oil, it needed access to the regions that possessed it. And in 1913, the world's most promising untapped reserves lay within the Ottoman Empire, particularly in the provinces of Baghdad and Mosul in Mesopotamia. These territories were not yet producing oil in significant quantities. But geologists were certain the fields were there, waiting beneath the desert. Whoever controlled Mesopotamian oil would control the fuel supply of the future. Britain could not allow that power to fall into hostile hands. The same calculations were being made in Berlin, Paris, and New York. The great powers understood what was coming. Oil was not merely an energy source. It was the lifeblood of modern warfare, modern industry, modern civilization itself. As automobiles multiplied on American and European roads, as factories converted to oil-fired furnaces, as electricity grids expanded and navies modernized, global demand was exploding. Standard Oil and its subsidiaries dominated the American market. Royal Dutch/Shell and Anglo-Persian competed for European customers. But the Middle East remained largely untapped. It was virgin territory in the petroleum age, and the Ottoman Empire sat atop it weak and dying. In 1912, a shadowy consortium had formed in London. It called itself the Turkish Petroleum Company, TPC for short. The venture brought together Royal Dutch/Shell, the German Deutsche Bank, and the Turkish National Bank in a joint effort to secure oil exploration rights within Ottoman territories. At first glance, it appeared to be a purely commercial arrangement, a business venture like any other. But nothing involving oil in the Ottoman Empire was purely commercial. Behind the scenes, governments pulled strings, diplomats applied pressure, and intelligence agencies gathered information. The Turkish Petroleum Company was a creature of imperial ambition disguised as corporate enterprise. The key figure in the TPC's formation was neither British nor German nor Turkish. He was an Armenian businessman named Calouste Gulbenkian. Born in Istanbul to a wealthy merchant family, educated in London, fluent in 5 languages, Gulbenkian possessed an almost supernatural talent for negotiating oil deals. He understood the geology, the economics, the politics, and most importantly, the personalities involved. He could sit across from an Ottoman minister, a British oil executive, a German banker, and a French diplomat, and find the thread that bound them together. Later, the world would call him Mr. 5%, a nickname he earned by securing a 5% stake in every major oil deal he brokered. For now, he was simply the fixer who made the Turkish Petroleum Company possible. In March 1914, the British government maneuvered to strengthen its position within the TPC. The Turkish National Bank shares, effectively controlled by Britain, were transferred to the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, giving London a commanding influence over the consortium. 3 months later, in June 1914, the Ottoman Grand Vizier signed a preliminary agreement granting the TPC a concession to explore and develop oil fields in the provinces of Baghdad and Mosul. The deal was not yet finalized, but the pieces were in place. Britain had secured the inside track to Mesopotamian oil. Then on June 28, 1914, a Serbian nationalist named Gavrilo Princip shot and killed Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary in Sarajevo. 5 weeks later, Europe was at war, and the entire chessboard shattered. The Great War consumed everything. Millions of men marched into trenches and did not return. Cities burned. Dynasties fell. The old world died in the mud of Flanders and the mountains of Gallipoli. But even as the slaughter raged, the victors-to-be were already dividing the spoils. And oil was at the center of their calculations. In 1916, while the Battle of the Somme ground through its 5th month of carnage, 2 diplomats met in secret to carve up the Ottoman Empire. Sir Mark Sykes represented Britain. François-Georges Picot represented France. Neither man had ever set foot in most of the territories they were dividing. Neither spoke Arabic. Neither consulted the people who actually lived in the lands they were apportioning. But they had maps, colored pencils, and the confidence of empire. That was enough. The Sykes-Picot Agreement, finalized in May 1916, was a masterpiece of imperial arrogance. It drew straight lines across deserts and mountains, splitting the Arab provinces of the Ottoman Empire into British and French spheres of influence. France would control Syria and Lebanon. Britain would take Iraq and Palestine. The exact boundaries remained vague. Details could be settled later, but the intent was clear. When the war ended, the Ottoman territories would not gain independence. They would simply exchange one master for another. The agreement was secret. It had to be. During the war, Britain had made contradictory promises to the Arabs, encouraging them to revolt against Ottoman rule by hinting at independence. The Arab revolt, led by Faisal ibn Hussein and advised by the enigmatic T. Lawrence, tied down Ottoman forces and aided the British campaign in the Middle East. The Arabs believed they were fighting for freedom. They did not know that British and French diplomats had already decided their fate. Sykes-Picot was a betrayal waiting to be revealed. But for oil companies and governments focused on petroleum, the agreement had a clear message: the spoils would be divided between the victors. And when the war ended, those victors intended to claim Mesopotamia's oil. The Turkish Petroleum Company still existed on paper, but its German partners were now enemies of Britain and France. Deutsche Bank's shares would be confiscated as war reparations. The question was who would take them. The war ended in November 1918. The Ottoman Empire formally ceased to exist with the signing of the Armistice of Mudros. Allied forces occupied Istanbul. Turkish troops withdrew from Mesopotamia. And in London and Paris, politicians and oil executives began the real work, transforming wartime promises into legal concessions and dividing the petroleum riches of the Middle East. In April 1920, the Allied powers met at the Italian resort town of San Remo to finalize the partition of Ottoman territories. Britain was awarded the mandate over Iraq, Mesopotamia rebranded under its ancient name. France received the mandate over Syria. The League of Nations, the idealistic new international body created to prevent future wars, rubber-stamped the arrangements. In theory, the mandates were temporary, meant to guide the territories toward eventual independence. In practice, they were colonies with better public relations. The San Remo Conference also formalized the fate of the Turkish Petroleum Company. Deutsche Bank's confiscated shares, 25% of the TPC, were transferred to the French government. France, in turn, created a state-backed oil company called the Compagnie Française de Pétrole to hold those shares. The remaining 75% of the TPC was split between Anglo-Persian and Royal Dutch/Shell, with Calouste Gulbenkian retaining his magical 5%. Britain and France now controlled the consortium that held the concession to Mesopotamian oil, and the United States had been shut out completely. In Washington, American oil executives and State Department officials reacted with fury. The United States had entered the war in 1917, tipping the balance in favor of the Allies. American soldiers had fought and died in France. American loans had financed the British and French war efforts. American resources had helped secure victory. And now, in the peace, American companies were being denied access to the oil fields of the former Ottoman Empire. It was an outrage. It was intolerable, and it would not stand. Standard Oil, the sprawling petroleum empire forged by John D. Rockefeller and broken apart by antitrust lawsuits in 1911, still dominated the American oil industry through its fractured subsidiaries. Standard Oil of New Jersey, Standard Oil of New York, Standard Oil of California, the so-called Seven Sisters that would define global oil markets for the next half-century, were desperate to secure foreign reserves. American oil production was still robust in 1920, but geologists warned that domestic fields were being depleted faster than new discoveries could replace them. If American companies did not gain access to foreign oil, particularly in the Middle East, the United States could face shortages. National security was at stake. The U.S. government threw its weight behind the oil companies. Secretary of State Bainbridge Colby protested the San Remo Agreement, arguing that it violated the principle of the open door, equal access for all nations to commercial opportunities. The open door policy had originally been applied to China, but American diplomats now invoked it for the Middle East. The former Ottoman territories, the State Department insisted, should not be treated as exclusive preserves of Britain and France. American companies must be allowed to compete. In February 1920, Congress passed the Mineral Leasing Act, a piece of legislative retaliation with sharp teeth. The law denied drilling rights on publicly owned land in the United States to any foreign company whose home government discriminated against American businesses. The message to London and Paris was unmistakable. If you lock us out of Mesopotamian oil, we will lock you out of American oil. It was hardball diplomacy, and it worked. Britain and France did not want a trade war with the United States. Both nations were exhausted and bankrupt after 4 years of total war. Both depended on American loans for post-war reconstruction. Both understood that isolating American oil companies could provoke a broader economic confrontation that they could not afford. Reluctantly, they agreed to negotiate. The talks dragged on for years. British and French oil executives resisted sharing their prize. American companies demanded a meaningful stake in the Turkish Petroleum Company. Calouste Gulbenkian, ever the dealmaker, shuttled between London, Paris, and New York, smoothing over disputes and preserving his own 5%. Governments applied pressure. Lawyers drafted and redrafted agreements. And all the while Mesopotamia itself, now the British Mandate of Iraq, remained in turmoil. Iraqi resistance to British occupation had erupted in 1920 in a nationwide revolt. British forces, exhausted from the Great War, struggled to suppress the uprising. Villages were bombed from the air, a brutal tactic that would become a hallmark of Britain's mandate rule. The revolt was eventually crushed, but the cost was high in both blood and treasure. The British installed Faisal ibn Hussein, the leader of the Arab revolt, as king of Iraq in 1921, hoping to create a stable client state. But Iraq remained restive, and the vast oil reserves beneath Mosul and Baghdad remained untapped. Meanwhile, another player was entering the game. In 1923, the newly proclaimed Republic of Turkey, rising from the ashes of the Ottoman Empire under the leadership of Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, was negotiating the Treaty of Lausanne with the Allied powers. Turkey had fought a war of independence against Greek forces and allied. occupation, and Ataturk had emerged victorious. The treaty would define Turkey's borders and its future. And one American saw an opportunity. His name was Rear Admiral Colby Mitchell Chester, and he believed he had found a way to outmaneuver the British, the French, and every major oil company in the world. Chester was a retired naval officer turned entrepreneur, a man with grand visions and a talent for securing the attention of powerful people. In the chaos of the Ottoman Empire's collapse, he had made contact with Turkish officials and secured a concession that, on paper, was breathtaking in scope. The Chester Concession, as it came to be known, was granted by the Ottoman government in 1910 and revived by the new Turkish Republic in 1923. It promised Admiral Chester's Ottoman American Development Company the right to build railways across vast stretches of Anatolia, connecting Turkey's interior to the Mediterranean and extending into the oil-rich regions of what is now northern Iraq, including Mosul. More critically, the concession granted the company exclusive rights to exploit natural resources, including oil and minerals, within a 20-kilometer corridor on either side of the proposed railway lines. If the concession were fully realized, it would give American interests control over a swath of territory that dwarfed the holdings of the Turkish Petroleum Company. The timing seemed perfect. Turkey was desperate for foreign investment and infrastructure development. The War of Independence had left the country devastated. Ataturk needed railways to unify and modernize his new republic. And Chester, with his American backing, promised to deliver. On April 10, 1923, the Turkish Grand National Assembly approved the concession. The Ottoman American Development Company had secured one of the most ambitious economic agreements in history. In Washington, American oil companies and State Department officials celebrated. It appeared that the United States had outflanked Britain and France in the race for Ottoman oil. But there was a fatal flaw. The Chester concession depended entirely on Mosul being part of Turkey. And Mosul was not part of Turkey. It was part of the British Mandate of Iraq. Under the Treaty of Sèvres, signed in 1920 but never fully implemented, the Allies had attempted to dictate harsh terms to the defeated Ottoman Empire, including the loss of Mosul to British-controlled Iraq. The Turks rejected the treaty and fought back. The Treaty of Lausanne, signed in July 1923, 3 months after the Chester concession was approved, was far more favorable to Turkey. Ataturk regained eastern Anatolia and abolished the humiliating foreign capitulations that had given European powers control over Ottoman finances. But Lausanne left the status of Mosul unresolved. The question was referred to the League of Nations. Britain was not about to give up Mosul. Winston Churchill, now colonial secretary, understood that Mosul's oil was critical to maintaining British dominance in the Middle East. British diplomats lobbied the League of Nations intensely. British forces remained stationed in the region. And in 1926, after lengthy deliberations, the League awarded Mosul to Iraq, and therefore to British control. Turkey received a small financial consolation, 10% of oil royalties from Mosul for 25 years. But the oil fields themselves and the concessions to exploit them remained in British hands. The Chester concession collapsed. Without Mosul, the railway project made little economic sense. The oil-rich corridor that had made the concession valuable no longer existed within Turkish territory. American investors, who had been skeptical from a start, withdrew. Admiral Chester's Ottoman American Development Company could not secure the financing it needed. In November 1923, the Turkish government quietly annulled the concession. The grand American scheme to seize Ottoman oil had failed. But American oil companies had not given up. While Chester's concession was crumbling, a different strategy was bearing fruit. The negotiations over the Turkish Petroleum Company were finally nearing conclusion. In 1925, after 5 years of diplomatic wrangling, the British and French governments agreed to allow American companies into the consortium. The TPC was reorganized to include the Near East Development Corporation, a syndicate of American oil giants, Standard Oil of New Jersey, Standard Oil of New York, Gulf Oil, Pan American Petroleum, and Atlantic Refining. Each member of this American group would receive a share of the TPC's oil production. It was a victory, but a limited one. The Americans were not equal partners. They were latecomers, allowed into the club only after persistent diplomatic pressure from Washington and threats of economic retaliation. And the concession itself was still not producing oil. Despite holding exploration rights since 1914, the TPC had yet to strike a major discovery. The geology was promising, but the political chaos in Iraq, the lack of infrastructure, and the conflicts among the consortium members had delayed serious drilling operations. That changed in October 1927. Near the ancient city of Kirkuk, in northern Iraq, a TPC drilling team hit oil. The well erupted in a geyser of petroleum that shot 50 feet into the air. For 9 days, workers struggled to cap the flow as thousands of barrels of crude oil gushed across the desert. When the well was finally brought under control, there was no longer any doubt. The Kirkuk field was vast. Mesopotamian oil was not a geologist's fantasy. It was real, abundant, and commercially viable. The scramble to control it intensified. In 1928, the consortium partners, now including the Americans, met to formalize the terms of their cooperation. The result was the agreement that would shape Middle Eastern oil politics for the next 2 decades, the Red Line Agreement, signed on July 31, 1928, in the Belgian resort town of Ostend. The deal was named for a crude map used during negotiations. According to legend, Calouste Gulbenkian pulled out a red pencil and drew a sweeping line across a map of the Middle East, tracing the approximate boundaries of the defunct Ottoman Empire. Everything inside the line, Gulbenkian declared, would be governed by the agreement. The name stuck. Under the terms of the Red Line Agreement, the 4 major shareholders, Anglo-Persian, Royal Dutch/Shell, the company Française de Pétroles, and the Near East Development Corporation, each received 23.75% of the crude oil produced by the TPC, which was renamed the Iraq Petroleum Company, in 1929. Calouste Gulbenkian retained his sacred 5%. The agreement covered an enormous territory: Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, most of Saudi Arabia, and parts of Turkey. Only Kuwait, Egypt, and the western edge of Jordan were excluded. But the Red Line Agreement contained a clause that would come to haunt the American companies. It was called the Self-Denying Clause. Under its terms, each member of the consortium pledged not to pursue independent oil concessions within the Red Line territory unless all the other members agreed. In other words, if Standard Oil of New Jersey wanted to explore for oil in Syria or Saudi Arabia or anywhere else within the Red Line, it could not do so without the unanimous consent of Anglo-Persian, Shell, the French, and Gulbenkian. The clause was designed to prevent competition among the partners and ensure that Middle Eastern oil development remained a collective, controlled enterprise. At the time, the American companies accepted the clause. They were desperate for access to Iraqi oil, and the self-denying provision seemed like a reasonable price to pay. Besides, in 1928, the Red Line encompassed virtually all the known oil prospects in the Middle East. Saudi Arabia was an impoverished desert kingdom with no proven reserves. What could possibly be worth pursuing outside the consortium's protection? The Americans had no idea what they had just signed away. In accepting the Red Line Agreement's self-denying clause, they had voluntarily entered a gilded cage. For the moment, it did not matter. Iraqi oil was flowing. The Iraq Petroleum Company laid pipelines from Kirkuk to the Mediterranean, crossing hundreds of miles of desert to reach export terminals in Palestine and Syria. By the early 1930s, Middle Eastern crude was reaching European refineries. The consortium partners were making money. The British government was securing oil supplies for the Royal Navy. The French State Oil Company was establishing itself as a global player. And the American companies were finally getting their share of Ottoman oil. But the self-denying clause began to reveal its true cost in the 1930s, when new discoveries outside the original Red Line boundaries proved that the Middle East held far more oil than anyone had imagined. And the Americans, bound by their 1928 promise, watched helplessly as independent companies seized opportunities they could not touch. In 1932, Standard Oil of California, SoCal, one of the smaller American oil companies not part of the Red Line Consortium, secured a concession from the impoverished Kingdom of Bahrain, a small island in the Persian Gulf just outside the Red Line's boundaries. Geologists had been skeptical that Bahrain held any oil. But in June 1932, SoCal struck oil. It was not a massive field by later standards, but it was proof that oil existed beyond Iraq. And it was only the beginning. The following year, 1933, SoCal pulled off an even bigger coup. The company's representatives approached King Abdulaziz ibn Saud, the founder of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and offered to pay for the right to explore for oil in the barren eastern province of Al-Hassa. Ibn Saud was desperate for revenue. His kingdom was poor, largely nomadic, and struggling through the Great Depression, which had devastated the pilgrimage economy that Mecca and Medina depended on. He needed cash. and SoCal was willing to pay. On May 29, 1933, the Saudi government granted SoCal a 60-year concession covering 360,000 square miles of territory in eastern Saudi Arabia. The deal included upfront payments, annual rents, and royalties on any oil discovered. It was an enormous gamble for SoCal. No one knew if Saudi Arabia had oil. British geologists dismissed the idea. The Iraq Petroleum Company, which held exclusive rights within the Red Line, had shown no interest in pursuing Saudi concessions. But SoCal was willing to take the risk. In 1938, after 5 years of drilling dry holes and near failures, SoCal's geologists struck oil at Dammam No. 7, a well in eastern Saudi Arabia. The flow was modest at first, but further exploration revealed that Saudi Arabia sat atop the largest petroleum reserves ever discovered. The Ghawar field, the largest conventional oil field in the world, lay beneath the desert sands. Saudi Arabia would eventually prove to hold more than a quarter of the world's proven oil reserves. And it all belonged to SoCal, later renamed Chevron, not to the Iraq Petroleum Company consortium. The American companies trapped inside the Red Line Agreement watched in agony. Standard Oil of New Jersey and Standard Oil of New York, both members of the Iraq Petroleum Company, could see the future of global oil unfolding in Saudi Arabia. They wanted in, but the self-denying clause prevented them from pursuing independent concessions without the unanimous consent of their consortium partners. And those partners, particularly the British and French, had no intention of allowing American companies to expand their foothold in the Middle East. In 1936, SoCal realized it could not develop the Saudi concession alone. The company lacked the capital, the refineries, and the global marketing network to turn Saudi crude into profits. So SoCal invited the Texas Oil Company, Texaco, to join as a partner. Together, they formed the California Arabian Standard Oil Company, later renamed the Arabian American Oil Company, or Aramco. Texaco bought a 50% stake, and the two companies began building the infrastructure needed to exploit Saudi Arabia's oil wealth: wells, pipelines, refineries, tankers, and export terminals. By the early 1940s, it was clear that Saudi Arabia, not Iraq, was the future of Middle Eastern oil. And the biggest American oil companies, Jersey Standard and Saucony, were locked out by their own agreement. The Red Line had become a trap. They had traded short-term access to Iraqi oil for long-term exclusion from the greatest petroleum reserves on Earth. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. World War II intensified the problem. The war consumed vast quantities of oil. American production surged to fuel the Allied war effort, but geologists warned that U.S. reserves were being depleted at an unsustainable rate. The future of American energy security lay overseas, particularly in the Middle East. President Franklin D. Roosevelt recognized this. In 1945, returning from a Yalta conference, Roosevelt met with King Ibn Saud aboard the USS Quincy in the Suez Canal. The two leaders forged a partnership that would define U.S.-Saudi relations for decades: American military protection in exchange for Saudi oil. It was the beginning of the oil for security bargain that still shapes Middle Eastern geopolitics. But Jersey Standard and Saucony were still trapped inside the Red Line. In 1946, desperate to gain access to Saudi oil, the two companies approached SoCal and Texaco with an offer. They wanted to buy into Aramco. SoCal and Texaco were willing to sell. The Saudi fields were so vast that sharing ownership made financial sense. But there was a legal problem. If Jersey Standard and Saucony joined Aramco, they would be violating the self-denying clause of the Red Line Agreement. They would be pursuing independent concessions within the Red Line territory without the consent of the Iraq Petroleum Company's other members. The British, the French, and Calouste Gulbenkian would object. And they did. The dispute over the Red Line Agreement became a legal and diplomatic battle. The British government, desperate to maintain its influence in the Middle East, sided with Anglo-Persian and Shell. Britain argued that the self-denying clause was binding and that the American companies could not simply walk away from their obligations. The French government, protective of its state-owned oil company, echoed the British position. Calouste Gulbenkian, now an elderly man living in exile in Lisbon, launched a furious legal campaign to enforce the agreement that had made him one of the richest men in the world. But the Americans had a powerful ally, the United States government. In the post-war world, America was the dominant global power. Britain and France were exhausted, bankrupt, and dependent on American aid through the Marshall Plan. Washington made it clear that enforcing the Red Line agreement against American companies was not in anyone's interest. The oil was needed. The Saudi partnership was strategic, and the United States would not tolerate European interference. In November 1948, after 2 years of negotiations, threats, and backroom deals, the Red Line Agreement was finally broken. The French and British governments, recognizing that they had no leverage against American power, withdrew their objections. Calouste Gulbenkian, pragmatic as always, accepted a settlement. In exchange for allowing Jersey Standard and Saucony to join Aramco, Gulbenkian and the French received increased shares of Iraq Petroleum Company output. The boundaries of the Red Line were redrawn, excluding Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Egypt, Israel, and Western Jordan. The self-denying clause was dead. Standard Oil of New Jersey and Standard Oil of New York promptly purchased 30% and 10% stakes in Aramco, respectively, joining SoCal and Texaco as partners. The 4 American companies now controlled the largest oil reserves in the world. The Iraq Petroleum Company, still producing oil in Iraq and Syria, continued to operate under British and French influence. But the center of gravity in Middle Eastern oil had shifted irreversibly to Saudi Arabia, and the Americans had won. It was a victory, but not the one they had sought in 1928. The United States had not quietly bought the Ottoman Empire's oil rights. It had fought for them through diplomacy, legal maneuvering, economic pressure, and the raw power of its post-war dominance. The process had taken 3 decades from Churchill's decision to convert the Royal Navy to oil in 1911, through the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, the secret partitions and broken promises of World War I, the San Remo Conference, the rise and fall of the Chester Concession, the formation of the Iraq Petroleum Company, the signing of the Red Line Agreement, and finally the post-war scramble for Saudi oil. The consequences of this struggle would echo through the rest of the 20th century and into the 21st. The Middle East, carved up by European imperialists and exploited by Western oil companies, would become the most volatile region on Earth. The borders drawn by Sykes-Picot, arbitrary lines that ignored ethnic, religious, and tribal realities, would fuel conflicts for generations. The partnership between the United States and Saudi Arabia, forged in the desperate need for oil, would entangle America in Middle Eastern politics in ways that Roosevelt could never have foreseen. The wealth generated by oil would transform impoverished desert kingdoms into some of the richest nations on the planet, but would also breed corruption, authoritarianism, and resentment. And the oil itself, the black gold that Churchill recognized as the lifeblood of modern power, would become both a blessing and a curse. It fueled economic growth and military might. It powered the automobiles, airplanes, and industries that defined the modern age. But it also created dependencies that nations could not escape. It concentrated wealth and power in the hands of a few multinational corporations and oil-rich states. It gave rise to OPEC, the 1970s oil shocks, and the petrodollar system that still dominates global finance. It funded terrorism, wars, and environmental devastation. And it locked the world into a carbon-based energy system whose consequences, climate change, geopolitical instability, resource wars, are still unfolding. The men who negotiated the Red Line Agreement in 1928 could not have imagined any of this. They were oil executives and diplomats focused on profits and strategic advantage. They saw a map of the Middle East and drew a red line around the territories they wanted to control. They created a cartel to eliminate competition and maximize returns. They believed they were securing the future. In a sense they were, but it was a future far more complex, dangerous, and tragic than they ever understood. The Ottoman Empire's oil was never truly bought. It was seized, divided, and fought over by powers that saw the Middle East not as a place where people lived, but as a reservoir of resources to be extracted. The Americans eventually secured their share, but the cost, measured in wars, interventions, environmental destruction, and the distortion of entire societies, was staggering. And the reckoning is not over. Today, more than a century after Churchill switched the Royal Navy to oil, the Middle East remains defined by petroleum. The Iraq Petroleum Company is long gone, dismantled in the 1970s when Middle Eastern governments nationalized their oil industries. The Red Line Agreement is a historical footnote. Calouste Gulbenkian died in 1955, his 5% transformed into a philanthropic foundation. The Seven Sisters oil companies have merged, restructured, and renamed themselves. Standard Oil of New Jersey is now ExxonMobil. Standard Oil of New York merged into Mobil, and then into Exxon. Chevron absorbed Gulf Oil. Shell and BP remain, but their dominance has eroded. Yet the fundamental dynamics established between 1911 and 1948, Western dependence on Middle Eastern oil, the strategic importance of the Persian Gulf, the entanglement of energy policy and foreign policy, persist. The United States military maintains bases throughout the region. Oil prices still drive geopolitical calculations. And the search for alternatives to fossil fuels, driven by climate change, is reshaping the global energy landscape in ways that may finally break the century-old grip of oil on international politics. The story of how the United States quietly bought the Ottoman Empire's oil rights is not a story of quiet transactions. It is a story of empires collapsing, maps redrawn, treaties signed and broken, fortunes won and lost, and consequences that cascade across generations. It is a reminder that the decisions made in boardrooms and diplomatic conferences, decisions about resources, profits, and power, shape the lives of millions who never had a voice in those rooms. And it is a warning that the scramble for resources, whether oil, water, or rare earth minerals, continues today in new forms with stakes just as high. The red line is gone from the map, but its shadow remains. Subscribe for more untold stories of power, oil, and the hidden forces that shaped our world.